looks like we got a critical mass of folks. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So thank everyone for joining us today. We hope that this is going to be helpful and sort of instructive panel, but we're also just going to try to make it really conversational. So in terms of just, I guess, housekeeping or structure, the first half of this will be us really talking. And then we'd love to just open it up, maybe with like 15, 20 minutes remaining, and have dialogue, answer questions that you have. If you want to come on screen and we can interact that way, that sounds great too. We're a pretty flexible group, so you just let us know. And then in the meantime, feel free to pop any questions that you have into the chat window, and I'll look at those as they pop up during the day. But with that, I'd love to just maybe start with each of us just introducing ourselves. Nona, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. My name is Nona Lee. My day job is Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer for the Arizona Diamondbacks. And since last year, I've also been chairing the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts through our DBACS for Change Council. And I'm very excited to be doing this work. It's something I'm very passionate about. And, I'm really excited about the topic today. I think it's going to be a really exciting conversation, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with Mike and Bandita.
Awesome. Thanks, Nona. I'm Bandita Cynthia Malakia. I am the treasurer for the National LGBT Bar Association. I'm proud to be Black, and I'm proud to be queer, and I'm proud to be here. So I'm excited to engage in this topic. I love talking about how, in particular, in the context of our community, Black people can rise, how we can be better understood, and how we can better understand one another in ways that we can just help one another. And so I'm interested in all of your wonderful questions. Hopefully we can have an engaging and candid discussion. Glad to be here.
No, that's great. And then finally, I am Mike Jackson. I'm going to be acting as the moderator today. I'm an assistant general counsel, senior director at Microsoft Corporation. That's one of my jobs. And the other job is I'm also our department's D&I chair. And then like both of my fellow co-panelists, I'm also a board member of the National LGBT Bar. Super excited to have this conversation. I think there's a lot for us to dig into, and I hope that you'll all enjoy. So with that, I'd love to start with just sort of the first question, and you both know where I'm going because we've talked about this before, but I guess my opening question is, some might argue, not me, but some might argue that, with the election of having had a Black president, with now having had our first Black, South Asian, and female president, there's been progress made, right? So why do we still need to have some of these dialogues that we're having? Isn't America more woke than not? Would just love to know both of your thoughts and responses there.
Yeah, my thought is America is waking, but I wouldn't say America is woke yet. I think, we can look around in many cases, the organizations we work for, and see that, we have a long way to go. I think this is a great time. I mean, we have an opportunity because we have our companies and the world's ear, our country's ear, in a way we haven't had before. And I think, what may be different this time is, we're talking about allyship, is that's a part of the movement now and what's happening.
I think that for so long, in particular, Black people, and even in the context of queer history, right? Black people and other people of color have kind of shouldered a lot of the progress making, a lot of the immigration laws used to at least start to combat xenophobia. A lot of the progress made in other social movements has at least started off the backs of some of the progress that Blacks have tried to make in the US and in other places. And, a noose near the Capitol is an indication that we're not woke. We're not anywhere close. And, it's, and we're not in active dialogue with all of you, but, if we were, I'd be really curious to know how many of your organizations were quick to say, maybe 7 or 8 months ago, 9 months ago, they, said Black Lives Matter on social media for the first time, or, maybe they said that they're going to prioritize Black and Brown people. How many of those organizations were quick to say internally, that this was a supremacist, racist, terrorist attack that happened on our soil against our government? How many were willing to actually say that? And if your organization wasn't, or if you and the people weren't, and that lets us know that none of us actually cares about anti-racism or diversity and inclusion as much as we say we do. And so really, it's for us to really get real. One of the conversations I've been having a lot this week is about how so many of us rely on the education piece, right? Rely on the fact that, I just didn't know. I wasn't aware. If I had this other training. Well, we've had racial reckonings before. We have them periodically, almost right on time after, several years. Everybody remembers that they just didn't know, they weren't educated. And really what everyone's trying to say is we either don't know what to do about it, or we're not willing to make the sacrifices required to actually do what's necessary. And so I think the first step to any kind of progress, whether it's with respect to racial justice or with respect to Alcoholics Anonymous, is to be aware that there's a problem. And so I think all of us just need to be aware that there's a problem and where we are.
I agree completely. I think the last year, I would say, I think has been really enlightening in terms of seeing where folks are and aren't, I think, on the journey. And I think also helping some folks understand, like, look, even if you've taken some early steps, it's really about sustained movement in this area. It's not just sort of standing up a D&I committee or standing up a D&I initiative and thinking it's one and done. It takes continued effort. So we have a great question in chat I'd love to pose to both of you. And I think it's going to lead into kind of another part of our conversation, which is how can corporate legal departments continue to move the needle on the allyship game, right? And that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, was allyship and how we really continue to advance the ball. So would love both of your thoughts there. Nona, maybe start with you, given your role with the Diamondbacks.
Well, I think it's educating, and it shouldn't always be our responsibility to educate, but to encourage people to educate themselves as well about the importance of allyship and the role that it can play. Teach people, tell people how important it is to use their voice and their privilege to help effectuate change, not just in our legal departments, but organizationally. And, to help people understand that we all have an obligation to affect change. It's not just up to the people who have been disenfranchised all of this time. I mean, what we've seen historically is change has not occurred at a meaningful and sustainable level, because, Black and Brown voices and queer voices are not always heard. And and they're not always in places where they can be heard. So it's really important for allies to use their voices, their power, their privilege to help shift the paradigm here.
Agreed. Bandita, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I lead global diversity efforts for my law firm. And so I am the proud recipient of many a missive from a legal department asking us about our diversity and inclusion initiatives, asking us about what we're doing and how we're doing it, asking for us to commit to specific metrics. So organizations are, and I think it's wonderful because it allows us to help move that 20% that refuses to be moved. Asking us, what are the percentage of Black lawyers, LGBT plus lawyers in the jurisdictions that we can, identify them, women, what's going on with these populations in the context of the representation of this client, and in outside counsel guidelines, this is what we expect. And so I fully expect, and I love to see when our clients are using their power to be able to one, partner with us meaningfully, but also to ask us what we're doing and how that matters. Now, sometimes it can go a little bit left. So sometimes, for instance, there'll be situations where clients, in an effort to bolster their own diversity and inclusion posture, won't necessarily be working on any internal initiatives, but will be using, outside counsel as the proxy for that. That, to me feels, it's great, but it also feels a little bit disingenuous. So anytime that we can actually meaningfully hit where it really matters for the development and the career trajectories of underrepresented talent is really what I love to see. Ask us about our goals and our metrics, ask us to set goals and metrics, ask us about how much meaningful work is going to who, and how many hours are going to who. I love that. And even better, ask us who the relationship partners are and whether we've got a succession plan, for who those folks can be down the line. And oftentimes when it comes to relationship credit, origination credit, succession planning, that's sometimes where we see a little bit of hesitancy from in-house legal departments wanting to kind of hedge their bets a little bit, because they do have longstanding relationships with some of the existing CRPs, and they've got internal dynamics to deal with among various departments. I dealt with this when I was in-house, where making a decision about a particular firm on diversity can be challenging, because you may be interrupting the progress of another function that uses the same firm. And what message are we sending, and what are we trying to send? So the politics are complicated. They can be complicated, in particular when you've relied on certain counsel for long periods of time. But I think the key is that we need to keep moving. And if you're going to ask us to consistently develop and advance the diversity of our population, it's also great when you deliver some work to go along with that, because it can be really challenging to have an existing matter and only have existing matters, and to say we need to diversify the team, a team that might have been working on a matter for 2 or 3 years, and say, hey, okay, white person, okay, straight person, you need to step aside because we need to let this Black person, this queer person, this other person join this matter. It doesn't go well. They're not going to be able to succeed. They're not going to get the support of their teammates with respect to understanding the culture of the client they're dealing with, best practices with respect to the client, any precedents. They're not going to share that information readily if they've been kicked off because of a diversity requirement. And so I really think that the dissemination of work together with requirements go hand in hand.
No, that's great. That's great, Mandita. And I want to latch on to one of the things you talked about too, just thinking about the corporate legal department aspect of it, which is, I think it's really critical to have it be a partnership, right? So like, it's not just what you're asking of your outside counsel, it's also what you're doing internally. And so that's something, I know within our org that we look at quite a bit, is like, how are we continuing to move the needle so that it's not just ask we're making externally, but we're also doing the same thing. I want to pivot real quick because we got a flurry of questions. So I want to make sure that we can answer some of the questions that are coming in. But one of the questions that we got, which I think is great, and Benita, I'll kick this over to you, but someone is saying, they're struggling as a junior lawyer in private practice of what to do about it. Between billing and client pressures, it can be really difficult to try to affect any kind of change in your position. As an associate this past year, we issued a statement to partnership stating our displeasure with the lack of Black lawyers in our ranks, but are struggling with sustaining and developing recommendations to partnership and management, especially given that we aren't trained in DEI or trained in culture. So how would you advise this person who's asked us about how they can continue to move the needle given their role as a junior lawyer within their organization? And Nona, I think this would be equally applicable in-house.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm really curious to answer to this, because this is right in her wheelhouse.
Yeah, so it's interesting. And I've actually written an article recently that will be published in April that's kind of about employee activism that has kind of my eye on this particular topic. The question first is, do you have a diversity function or not? Because there's a risk. The challenge with the law firm structure is that by and large, there are still independent fiefdoms where your work comes, and depending on how specialized or not you are, depending on the size of the function of the practice that you're in or whatever it is, you could have one or two people who really own your entire career. And so the way they think about you still matters. And some of that, even though they may not say it directly, may depend on how they feel about this advocacy that you're undertaking. And so if you do have a diversity team, I suggest working with them because it's their job. They're paid to take the hits. There are certain circumstances where it's useful to come together to do as you did and write a note to suggest some potential progression. But by and large, working to make sure that your diversity professionals have your input and that you're working with them and that you're getting their input about what the politics are. They do this every single day. And I would note that the best thing that you really can do, and this is going to sound horrible because we are a generation of activists, the best thing you can do is do really, really, really well, produce really, really, really great work and be investable so that you can stick it out so that you start to gain more capital and more political power. So you can get to the position where you're counsel or where you're a junior partner and eventually equity partner. So you really have the standing to exact change. When you're new, you're still making a ton of errors because that's what new people do. Where you're still learning how things go, where you don't necessarily have a lot of political capital to give. I don't advocate for people going to go to bat every single day about lots of issues. Now, of course, once in a while, raising your voice, of course, all of this depends on what your internal benchmark is with respect to your values. If you're not going to be able to sleep at night or something is fundamentally undercutting your thought process about whether or not you can actually work at this organization, then by all means, use your voice, but do so thoughtfully. Maybe there's an underrepresented partner who you can partner with to figure out what the best approach is. Maybe things might not necessarily look, maybe they're not exactly the way that they look, right? So one thing that I discover in conversations with associates every single day is that they don't have as much information, right? And everybody assumes they have a lot of information about how this place works. And sometimes just explaining to them, oh, this is how it works, but I know the result looks messed up, but this is actually how this place works, will give you more information to figure out how to address a problem. Because it's not always to say, we need to change this, or we need more data, or we need X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's a small systems change. Sometimes it's a small other change that you may not even need to go to management and let everybody know that you're a rabble rouser. You may be able to go to the IT person and say, hey, can we switch this thing on so that I can change my name in Zoom so I can add my pronouns, right? Like there may be just some intermediate interventions that can be taken. And so I always recommend first and foremost, go to diversity professionals. If you don't have one, you need to decide how important it is to you. If it's really important to you, go find somebody with power in the structure to help you advocate. And try to get as much information around the challenge as possible so that you can be more effective about what your asks are and really make specific targeted asks.
Yeah, thank you, Benedita. That was fantastic. And yeah, I agree with you completely. From an internal and an in-house perspective, I would say that, if you don't have a DEI function, as Benedita said, what you need to do really is find an ally, particularly someone, a person in power. If you can't find an underrepresented person who is at the table and has a voice, which occurs sometimes, then you need to find an ally who will help you advocate for change. And, allies, the whole point is that, often at the top, there are people who don't look like us, who are white, who are male, who may not have had the experiences that we have, but that doesn't mean that they're not willing to advocate on our behalf, for change. And so to the extent that you can find someone like that, definitely reach out to them and ask for their help to effectuate change, because as Benedita pointed out, whether internally or in-house or in a law firm, especially if you're a younger practitioner or younger employee, one of the things you have to keep in mind is what are you willing to put on the line to accomplish this? And, you need to be sure that you're stable in your career if that's where you want to be. But as Bandita said, if it is something that is so egregious to you that you can't be silent, then, I think it's always important to respectfully state your opinion. Because the one thing that we all of us, I'm sure, understand is that, often when we are disrespectful or if we're yelling, people can't hear us. So, just respectfully state your concerns to people in power so that, your voice at least is heard and they will consider making changes.
I agree completely with both of what you've said. I think the other thing I would just add is just around kind of the optimizing for impact. I think if I look back on my career, and I think a lot of people probably fall into this camp, right? I think there is this tendency sometimes to like, you want to go after everything, right? Like you're determined, like Bandita, thinking about your point, like once you get that standing, sometimes you want to attack all of the mountains, right? Like you're like, okay, well, there's this thing and there's this thing and there's this thing. And there is a need to sort of be strategic around what you're going to try to tackle and why you're going to try to tackle, and maybe even what order you're going to do it in, right? And then, Nona, to your point, like who are you going to pull in to help move the ball down the field a little bit on some of those particular things? So I agree wholeheartedly. So we've got a number of other questions I want to make sure we can pivot to. This question, I think, goes directly to some of what we're talking about today. So I'd love to ask both of you. Someone asked the question of what exists beyond allyship? What is the next level of support?
I think the next level is solidarity. But I think a lot of times we like to achieve, we're achieving people. And so we're like, how do we level up? I love leveling up, but I don't think that I've actually seen real, meaningful, consistent, sustained allyship yet. And so I would challenge everybody to engage in active allyship, right? Like you can't call yourself an ally. Somebody else has to call you an ally. And so, I would, suggest really thinking about, are you really doing, the two different types of allyship, at least in the way that I think about them. The first, and it's a little bit of a audis vitis model, but it's an upstanders model. Are you speaking up, listening up, talking up, and showing up, right? And so are you showing up to the events? Showing up here is great. Are you bringing people along with you? Are you talking up other people with underrepresented identities? Are you saying, well, I know you gave this opportunity to me, but actually I think Mike would be better. Or I think Nona is the perfect person to do this. I know you came here, but I think you should go there. Are you speaking up when you are experiencing things that don't align with your values or the stated organizational values? This is the hardest one. This is the one where I feel like most people who even call themselves allies fall short because they're trying to figure out what's the right time to do it. Well, the problem with white solidarity, with straight solidarity, with all of these pervasive kind of hegemonic solidarities is there is no right time because it's not the culture, right? And so you're going to be acting at the wrong time, but it's important to do that in whatever way that you can. Maybe it's putting something in the Zoom chat that says, actually, I don't agree with the way that was phrased. Or I would love to talk about this, about that particular comment a little bit later. I don't know why, but it didn't strike me the right way. But any way that you can kind of disrupt whatever's happening in the moment, the norm of whatever that racism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever it is the right thing to do. And listening up, making sure that you're actually, educating yourself and that you're really, really, really centering those experiences and not your experience in the moment of safety. One of the things that gets on my nerves the most as a Black queer woman is when people want to talk about their safety. Well, or when they say something that they think is a comment, oh, I love talking to you because you make me feel so safe in this conversation. I was like, well, I didn't do something right then, because I don't get to feel and experience safety every day in these identities. I mean, now I feel safer and fine because I navigate these identities every day and I do this for a living. But the idea, it's the essence of privilege is assuming that you should feel safe in every conversation, in every room that you show up to. And so if you're not a little bit uncomfortable, and if at least once a day you haven't experienced something that's some kind of ist or ick, then you're not listening, you're not engaging, you're not paying attention. So go read a book, look at a podcast, talk to a friend, whatever it is that you need to do so that you can start to be more aware. But I really think that really embracing this allyship is important. In brief, solidarity is really walking in concert. This is so ingrained in everything you do. It's like if something happened to my brother, I would probably just automatically punch somebody in the face. It'd just be a reflex. I wouldn't even have to think about it. I wouldn't have to think about what do I need to do. I don't even really like my brother that much. He knows this. And but if somebody did something to him, it wouldn't even occur to me to think about what I would do next. And that's really where we need to go, right? The problem right now is there's nothing reflexive about the ways that people across different identities stand up and speak to one another. And there's still sensitivity. When somebody says, wow, I think that might have been a little bit racist or biased or something else, if the first thing you do is clench up and say, I'm not racist, then you have work to do. Right? Because why can't you take that as feedback, just like anybody might say, I wasn't really that appreciative of your attitude, or I think you put the comma in the wrong place, or whatever other feedback that you're getting. So really doing the deep introspective work, and I have to do it every day with all the identities that I encounter, is really to me where the work is.
Yeah, 100% agree. When I heard the question, I thought about it, and what occurred to me is, we're just learning allyship. We're not even close to mastering that in my experience, as indicated by people. I have wonderful people in my life that I work with that want to be allies and are educating themselves about how to do that. But it's a work in progress. It's new, and it's more than just one thing. It's really a holistic approach to these issues. And as Bendita stated, until we master that, until that is mastered, it's difficult to we don't want to rush through this. It's taken 400 years to get to this point, or whatever it is. And so, I think we need to take our time and really understand what it means to be an ally in every respect, before we're so eager to jump onto something else. Because if we move too quickly through this, it will lose its meaning and it won't be sustainable.
I love that. I love both of those points. So I'm gonna pivot slightly and ask two questions, kind of conjoin two questions that I think could go together that we got that are both great questions. Someone's asked, how do you sort of keep sustained movement right now in this environment where we're in, where you've got the pandemic and that pulling on people's resources and energy? And someone else asked a question that I think ties into this a little bit, which is, how do you as a solo practitioner, move the needle here, right? Both questions being around resources, energy, time. So would love both of your thoughts on that, because it is a thing right now, right? Like it's something we have a little bit less of: energy, time, resources. So what do both of you think?
I think, in terms of the question about parallel things going on, the pandemic and the DE&I and racial justice, social justice in general. I think that in my mind, all of this happened for a reason, because, I often think if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic, not as much attention would not have been paid to these issues. And so we're in a unique time to really focus on these efforts and bring people's focus to these efforts. And we can't lose the momentum because there's a pandemic. We can't stop because there's a pandemic, because this really is a unique opportunity. In terms of being a sole practitioner, I think, a sole practitioner has many opportunities to be an ally. You can work with law students and work with young attorneys in different areas that you may work in, different bar associations, et cetera, and, get to know them and be available to refer them when you become aware of different opportunities. If you have an opportunity to hire someone, as an administrative assistant, of course, keep that in mind and hire someone from an underrepresented background. And to the extent you hire for contract work, I mean, there are plenty of opportunities to support people from underrepresented communities.
I agree with all of that. On the limited bandwidth piece, I have an internal struggle with the question, in particular because, and there have been more research and articles and books about this recently, but, to be an underrepresented person in this society is to be fatigued, right? Regardless of whether there's a pandemic, regardless of whether or not somebody got killed yesterday, the psychological tax of having to walk through the world, having to basically watch your step. When I walk in a department store, it doesn't matter that I went to Harvard Law School. It doesn't matter that I was in the house at 2 organizations. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. It doesn't even matter that I identify as being a woman and that I'm feminine presenting and not masculine presenting. I watch where my hands are. My hands stay out in front of me like I'm Queen Elizabeth. In part because I just don't want any questions, and because I've been questioned twice in my life, and very publicly and in a humiliating way by police for being, having been accused of stealing something that I never would have stolen. For the Black people out there, a large bottle of dry shampoo was the last time, for fishing trips or something. Just really inane stuff. And so, we think about how we move. We think about how we talk in meetings. We think about how we drive. I think about what I'm going to say if I happen to be looking down and look back up and get pulled over by the police. I think this is what we think about all day. We think about all these decisions over and over again. So it's really, really hard for me to have empathy for people who are like, the pandemic's hard because I have to stay inside and I'm worried about health. I get all of that. And those are burdens that underrepresented people have too. But this is a tax that we have all the time. I think about at work, what do I wear and why? What risks can I take? When I purchase blonde hair, what is that going to mean to people? Right? These are all the decisions that I think about ad nauseum that are in relationship to my Blackness that other people may or may not need to think about to the same extent. And so with all that being said, to the extent that you consider yourself an ally, your job is to do something, not just to read something yourself, although that's a good start, but to actually do something. Have you initiated a conversation? Have you interrupted bias somewhere? Have you extended an opportunity to somebody that doesn't identify in the way that you identify? Have you given money to some cause? What have you done? Take an action. All actions don't have to be exhaustive. But do something. And I think if everybody were doing something, that would be better. On the solo point, Nona's got it exactly right. There are lots of things you can do. Hire an underrepresented intern, to the extent that you have any donations that you'll make on behalf of your solo practice. Partner with an underrepresented organization. Who do you get your paper from? Who do you purchase your toner ink from? Who do you purchase supplies from? Think about where you're putting your dollars as a practice and who you're representing. Where do you throw your pro bono, if you have any? Who are you putting that support behind? Every single action matters. There are no neutral actions. So you're either in the cause advancing equity or you're not. And I think that's really the beneficial contribution that Imran Kendi made really is that framework. There's no not. You either are or you're anti. Thinking in those terms, I think, is really helpful in realizing none of us as individuals are going to overturn systemic racism. It's the combination and accumulation of all of these actions that are going to start to move toward a place of increased understanding and change for more people.
No, I think that I agree. I co-sign 100% what both of you said. And Medina, I want to pick up on something you said too and talk about, I think one of the things, I've tried to, just to the question of like energy, pandemic, I've tried to take advantage of this last year is like, look, to some extent, we have a little bit of a captive audience, right? Like everybody's working online, everybody's doing their thing. And we've been talking for years about courageous conversations and how to have courageous conversations. And so one of the things that we did internally this year is I said, well, let's just have them, right? Like, let's just have them like every month, have a different conversation on something that's uncomfortable, right? Like and again, the goal isn't to walk away with everyone feeling like, oh, that was great. The goal is to have people sort of really engage with the content and feel like, oh, wow, that may be a little bit uncomfortable, but I need to explore why that may be uncomfortable, right? So I think that's one piece I would say. I think the other piece I would just say right now is I've actually been surprised, I think, how when you think of concepts like covering, like I think I've actually been surprised how much that's been impacted by working from home and by the pandemic. And I think people who normally may have kept a little bit of a distance from DEI are a little bit more empathetic and sympathetic to it because their lives are on display right now, right? Like, I had a conversation with someone recently and she was talking about how, she felt like she was more empathetic to what one of her Black colleagues was going through in a conversation they were having because when they were talking about how they show up at work, because she thinks about that now every time her kids run in the room, right? She thinks about it now because people can see her house in the background and she's wondering how they're assessing her, how they're judging her, and while that's not our lived experience, the fact that that is making her think more about someone else's experience, I think is a dialogue worth having. So I would just say, get creative within your orgs. There's a lot of different ways that you can have conversations right now, and people are probably, some of them, a little bit more open to it because of what they may be experiencing.
Any way we can increase empathy is great. I'm all about that wherever it comes from. The authenticity piece around Zoom is really interesting, and there's some interesting research that's starting to come out around this when we talk about what does it mean when you turn your cameras on and off? So for women, they didn't study LGBTQ plus people, but they looked at women and people of color in the US and the UK. And for women, people think it means that you're not paying attention to care for children, whether or not you have children. And for people of color, it means that you are not like us. So you have something to hide if your camera's off. And if you're on and you have a Zoom background up, then you also have something to hide. So the trust factor actually goes down. So even though we're seeing more into people's lives and people are at home, the trust angle is compromised there. And then when people actually show the environment, unless it's kind of perfectly appointed, Mike Jackson style or Nona Lee style, people's comments about what that means and about who you are. And, so if you've got your little, African statue in the back, people start to feel like, not quite like me, right? And so much of the game around being investable, and this is why sponsorship is really so important, is because there's an innate human connection that happens between two people where they see somebody who's achieving and they say, wow, oftentimes it's on the basis of affinity bias. They'll say, wow, this person reminds me of me, or I have some emotional connection to this person one way or another, and they're achieving. So I want to put my money in that piggy bank. I want to bet on that horse. And one of the biggest challenges that underrepresented people have with getting invested in is that that authenticity relationship piece is missing because people don't naturally see you with them. So if you've got the artwork that they don't understand, or if your place isn't as well appointed as they ought to be, or even if there are kids running around in the background, because we like to sometimes pretend that children, don't exist, or that somehow we timed out of that part of the pandemic. People may have a view about who you are and what you're doing. And so, as noted, I think any way that we can connect with others is really important. Any way people can continue to build the connections. I would be hesitant, though, about thinking about starting a conversation with an underrepresented person that starts something like, I'm stuck at my house, so now I understand what it's like to be a person of color. That's not going to go well for you.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And thank you for that, Bandita. And I do love your crown. I noticed someone else commented on it. It's totally appropriate. I just want to pick up on something that Mike said too, in terms of, this virtual world and having conversations. And, one of the things that we did internally is have those conversations and have them consistently and open them up to people. And I was really surprised by how, I work in baseball, which is a, male-dominated, white male-dominated industry primarily. But to see people have open conversations, to see them, it wasn't mandatory, but to see, 200 people keep coming back every time for every session because they wanted to hear, they wanted to learn, and to hear them open up and talk about their perception or their experience and what they were experiencing, that they didn't realize these problems still existed. They didn't think about it. They hadn't heard the experiences of their peers from underrepresented communities. And so these conversations are critical for those reasons, and it's just as important that the conversation and the understanding goes both ways. But, all of that is to say that I think that the opportunity to have these conversations virtually is invaluable, because I think there's probably in many ways more participation and in some ways perhaps more authenticity for some people than there would otherwise be in a face-to-face conversation. And query, would they show up for that conversation, or would it be too uncomfortable? So I think there's some benefit to this. Like I said before, I believe strongly that it's not lost on me that all of this is happening at the same time, and we're in a position to focus on these things in a way that we've never been able to or taken the time to before, and in a very different way, virtually. And so my great hope is that we'll continue to have these conversations and continue to build on this and not lose the momentum that we have.
Yeah, I agree completely. So it looks like we got a few folks who are willing to go live. So why don't we open it up and take questions from our audience? So looks like, I know we had Jessica, looks like you have your hand raised. You want to ask a question? No? Was there anyone else? I know we had a few hands raised. If not, I will turn to one of the questions that was just submitted to us that I think is a really, really great question, actually, which is how should we think about, so if we're talking about sort of the different constituencies within each environment, someone asked a question as, how can they move the needle as support staff at a law firm, right? And so they gave an example of, hearing what they consider to be a microaggression and really wanting to take action on it, but haven't gotten any traction. What advice would you give to someone who, and I think, Benita, this maybe goes to an earlier point you were making, occupies a position within their organization where maybe they feel like they can't get traction?
Yeah, I firmly believe that there's something every single person can do from where they sit. And I think it first and foremost starts with looking to your left and your right, if you're a manager or other leader, looking to your left, right, above, and below. So if you're at a frontline contributor level or otherwise might consider yourself or be considered a junior member of your organization, everybody has a certain amount of privilege in every single space. And so if you're in meetings with your team and you understand that there are other people around you who are not necessarily getting the same kind of work that you're getting, and you don't necessarily understand why, sometimes asking the question, right? It can be really hard to go and tell people. And I know this from my daily experience because, I don't have this anymore, but whenever I first started doing D&I work, there are people who don't really know me very well. Whenever I speak or challenge or have a conversation, people don't necessarily hear what I have to say. What they hear is, you're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic. And I've almost never used those words in the context of my work life because it doesn't necessarily help me as a diversity professional. So I understand that you may not be able to directly challenge in that way, but you can ask the question. You can say, the last 3 new projects that I got to be the project management lead on came to me, how can we share this across the team? I saw that this, new initiative, or we need a point person to this new initiative at the organization. I'm glad you asked, but are there other people who can be brought in? Because I'm sure that they would benefit from that experience. And so really thinking about the space that you're taking up and the benefits that you have and figuring out, Can those be shared? Are there occurrences that are happening where you're noticing that some people aren't included? You can check in on people. That's not just the province of managers. You can go check in on people. You can go check on the people who you report to as well. How are people doing? What's going on? If you want to have conversations about different topics related to race or otherwise, you can start those conversations. Everybody can start a meeting. Like nobody, and if you come to the point where somebody says, actually, I don't want you having these meetings, then that's a time for you to consider, one, what's behind that, and two, after you figure out what's behind that, whether or not this is actually an organizational environment that you want to be in. And so I think really just looking at your own environment, I don't think that you have to be the person who has to start something new, create a whole plan, get everybody behind it. To me, I often find that that's not necessarily where the most change is made. Making change where you are is really, really, really important. Also encourage your diversity professionals if you have them. If you don't, encourage your human resources team and other teams in the context of their efforts, just asking the question, what about business services professionals? What about staff? And oftentimes asking the question will be the start of some amount of dialogue.
No, I think that's great, Bandita. One of the other questions that we got, and I think it's a great question, is how can we think about this in the nonprofit space, right? And I think something directly applicable to all of the work that we've done in the nonprofit space. But someone's asking the question about how can they think about allyship and continuing to advance in the DEI space in the nonprofit space.
Yeah, in my view, it's really the same as it would be in any other space. I mean, your nonprofit presumably has employees, and so think about how allyship can be implemented throughout your organization, and how you can use your power and your privilege to advance inclusion in your organization, diversity and inclusion. And the same thing, I mean, as I think Bandita talked about before, is your buying power. All businesses, nonprofit or otherwise, you have to spend money on certain things. And so another way that, you can make a difference. Look at, women and minority-owned businesses and spend your resources there to the extent that you can. And also be sure, nonprofits have the ability, and it depends on the nonprofit that you have, but, think about, how you can fit DEI into your mission, and be sure that you're serving underserved communities as part of your mission to the extent possible, if not directly, certainly indirectly.
Yeah. I think the three attributes, I'll call them attributes, that are missing the most for most people related to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that are necessary are empathy, humility, and vulnerability. It's the thing I think about every single day as I wake up in the morning. I need to really center everyone I'm dealing with, regardless of their background, because everyone has a story and every single person is important because they're human, regardless of what they believe, regardless if they don't think the same thing about me. Humility, because we don't know what we don't know. I mean, that's what all this unconscious bias training all of us have done over and over again over the years. That's the whole essence of it. We don't know what we don't know. And so being humble, which is so hard for people in the legal profession, and that, I think, in a lot of aspects, we're either the worst or close to the worst, but just admitting I might not know. And where could that lead you? If you assume that you don't know, like I assume that I don't know how to conduct surgery on somebody, and assuming that is going to mean that I actually don't, perform surgery on anyone. And that's an important outcome in a particular situation, right? And so assuming making sure that you just don't have any assumptions about your knowledge and your abilities is really important. And being vulnerable, like own where you are in your journey and just be committed to keep moving forward. And I mentioned these three sentiments, attributes, whatever you want to call them, because I find that there's a lot of hubris in particular from people in the nonprofit space directed towards people in corporates, people in professional services firms, and money-making and profit-making enterprises, because there's some assumption that just because what you're doing doesn't necessarily have a profit motive at its center, that everything's all good. And what I've tended to find is that these are the organizations that have the hardest time in actually trying to push forward an initiative, because we're not even beyond the point of recognizing there's a problem. At least in large law firms, we know there's a problem. We're very aware there's a problem. We talk about it every single day, but a lot of the nonprofits have that. And so I would just say, empathy, humility, vulnerability are incredibly important. And that's really the starting point. You have contracts with people, you still spend money, you hire people, you can do an analysis of who your workforce is. You still have people who say really whack things in meetings. You have people who don't communicate with everybody on the team, right? You've got all the same dynamics that happen in any organization. And so really just taking a look to figure out what are the experiences of the underrepresented people who are there? What does the data look like? And how do those things marry to show us what our priorities should be for the year, and then attack those with vigor?
I love that. So I want to pivot a little bit because we got a few questions in this vein. I think it's a really interesting question. I think something we're all going to have some thoughts on. But essentially, we've gotten a few questions around what role or what responsibility do law schools play when you think about the fact that they're sort of the beginning of the pipeline, right? Before people even hit practice. What role do they play in thinking about DEI training for students? What role do they play in sort of DEI within the profession, or should they play?
In my view, they have the same obligation as organizations do, professional organizations, whether they're nonprofits or other businesses, to step into this space and begin to effectuate change. And that includes, supporting their students in what they need, providing education to their staff and their students so that they can understand, to the extent they don't already, what the issues are and how to effectuate change. As Bandita said, from where they are, if they're a student, what they can do in their space to effectuate change. I think I saw a question about performative and what to do, or performative DEI, and what to do when they see that. And it's really use your voice, speak up, hold them accountable. And I know that's when you're a law student, but also consider that you're a law student because you want to advocate for change in some way for someone. And so this is a great way to start to use those skills. And so, from the law student perspective, be vocal, step into the space, be sure that you're advocating for other students who may not have a voice or may not have access to some of the privileges that you have. And from a institutional perspective, I think you really have an obligation to start to provide training on this, provide classes on these issues. There are many opportunities. Bandita, I can see you.
The wheels turning.
Lots of ideas. It's interesting because just because you're early in your career doesn't mean that you've got less power. In some ways, in certain parts of the process, you have more power than anybody.
Yeah.
I actually think law students have more power than junior associates at law firms to make change, because law firms are trying to find you and they want you and they don't know that they have you yet. And so you can provide input on your OCI process. If you hear people at a particular organization who are speaking in a way that's not inclusive, you can offer that feedback. You might want to wait to offer it until after they, have, accepted or rejected or waitlisted you or whatever happens. That's up to you. I'm not going to get in the way of anybody's money. But offer that input. You've got the ability to go with other law students to say, hey, this is how you can attract us, by having these types of initiatives. But I talk to law students all the time who I'm trying to convince that Hogan Lovells is the place for them to be, right? And so I'm the person who already has a job at Hogan Lovells. So from my perspective, you've got some power to be able to influence and assert what you want to see in red, and people will start to follow that. I think law schools, and I'm really proud of the work the LGBTQ bar has done with respect to reaching out to law schools, understanding law school climate, and in providing programming for our law students. And this is the place where people learn or are supposed to learn how to be professionals. And so I always encourage, law school deans, when I have the opportunity to talk to them, that we need to start focusing on not just teaching law students how to think, but we need to teach them what the workplace is going to be like. That people are going to say some really whack things, that every time somebody says something whack, it's not about to be a debate, right? We need to teach them how things go. And it doesn't mean that things have to stay that way or that we shouldn't advocate for change, but we need to better prepare people about what the workplace looks like and give people the advocacy tools within the places that they may end up, and let people know about different work settings and what those experiences may be like. And it's not always clear cut, and how to be able to identify a good workplace, how to identify an inclusive manager. We really need our law schools to really start educating people on this is how you can be yourself, and yourself may, depending on the situation, may need to be adapted. And authenticity isn't pure. And how to navigate and negotiate that. These are all conversations that can start at law school. And I hope that they do, because a lot of times we see a lot of junior associates who come in with a rude awakening about how work works and the fact that maybe you won't be able to have green hair and wear a hoodie every day. Just because you're smart and can work like that anyway, you might not actually be able to do that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, with respect to students, another thing that you can do is form affinity groups, go to the law school and ask to do so if one doesn't already exist, and that includes an affinity group for allies, and bring in and speakers and put on events to help people learn about allyship.
Yeah, I agree with both those points. The other thing I would just say to any law students on the call is, as you start to build your network through summer clerkships, internships, leverage your network, right? All three of us, each of us, have busted down different doors, have done different things. And to the extent that we're able to sort of lean in and help you so that you don't have to sort of retread some of the same steps that we had to do or had to take, that's something we'll do, right? And so I'd say leverage your networks too. That's a question, I think I always encourage a law student. So we have a few minutes remaining. I'd love final thoughts from each of you, just to close us out.
I would just say, first of all, I'm so glad we had this conversation, and want to thank you, Mike, for asking me to be on the panel. I always enjoy any conversation with you and Bandita. But these conversations are so important, and what is important is that they continue, not just of course, in panels, but in every aspect, whether in whatever groups we belong to. The conversations have got to continue. And it's really important that we remember, all of us, that we're all responsible for change. We're all responsible for diversity and inclusion. It doesn't reside just with one group, with one department. It's going to take all of us to create meaningful and sustainable change. So we need to use our voice. We need to use our privilege wherever that exists to effectuate change. And as Bandita pointed out, it's never too early to start.
I think that Nona is 100% correct, as per usual. And I would just say, interestingly enough, it's Black History Month. Don't be afraid to say the word Black. I see a lot of spaces where things that start off as pertaining to Black people, maybe there's a problem that starts related to Black people that ends up converting to people, the solution converts to people of color or women and minorities or, whatever it is. I think it's important when you have a problem to name it. Right? Like, so, if, I've injured my toe, I don't say, well, my leg is hurting. Right. And so I think it's important to say, what's, to name it and not be afraid to say that word. We've got a lot of energy and baggage around Blackness in particular in this country, even within the queer community. And so I would encourage each and every one of you to not be afraid to name what you are seeing and hearing and experiencing. And I would also encourage every single person to do something today. A former member of the LGBTQ bar board, who I love dearly, does something that I love. And they reach out to a group of people periodically at random and say, what do you need me to do for you today? I'll do anything. Anything you ask me to do, I'll do. How great is that? I mean, sometimes I've got something, like this post, or ask somebody, if they could donate to this cause or whatever it is. But sometimes I'm just happy that somebody cared about me. So go to some people of color in your life, go to some queer people in your life, go to some people at the intersections, and ask a few people, what can I do for you today? And they may not have anything specific, but putting yourself out there is really the essence of allyship.
Agreed. Co-sign. And then my final thought I would just offer everybody is just remember what we've talked about today, which is it's a continued journey, right? There's no destination point with allyship. It's something we have to keep doing. We're going to keep doing it, the three of us. We want you all to keep doing it. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, Bandita. Thank you, Nona, for taking time out of your busy days. Had a lot of fun today, and we hope that you'll join us for future Lavender Link series. Thanks, everyone.
Great job, Mike. Good to see you, Nona. Thank you all for joining.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah, good to see you. Thank you,
Bye.
Mike.